The horse had refused the water for 3 days before Silas Rourke understood that the horse was not being stubborn. He had ridden the dun gelding for 11 years across the high plains between the Powder and the Tongue, and all that time the animal had never turned his nose from a running creek. Yet on the 4th morning of October, in the year 1886, in the shallow bend of Cold Fork Creek east of the Bighorn foothills, the dun stopped 10 feet from the bank, lowered his head once, lifted it again, and walked backward. Silas sat in the saddle for a long moment. He looked at the water. He looked at the horse. Then he looked at the ridge above the creek, and at the sky beyond the ridge, and at the pale, bruise-colored line that lay along the north where no cloud had any business being that early in the season. The dun's name was Merritt. He had never lied. The country around Cold Fork was a widow country that year. The Sanderson place lay a half-mile north of the creek, and the widow who ran it, Rachel Sanderson, 41 years old, 3 seasons into her husband's grave, had inherited 240 head of shorthorn cattle, a leaking barn, and the polite pity of every man in the settlement of Ashen Bend. Silas Rourke had come down through the mountains that autumn looking for winter work. He was 38. He had no wife, no land, and no debts. He had a dun horse that would not drink from a creek that any other horse in the county would have drunk from without hesitation, and that fact, more than any letter of introduction, was what eventually placed him under the widow's roof before the first snow fell. He rode to the Sanderson place slowly. He let Merritt choose the path. The horse skirted the creek by a wide margin, climbed a shoulder of grass that any sensible rider would have cut across, and came out on the north side of the ridge at a point where the wind ran differently than it did 50 yards below. Silas noted this. He noted where the horse's ears pointed and where they did not point, and what he did not do was try to correct the animal. There had been a time, when he was young, when he would have. The high country had corrected him out of that habit. The widow Sanderson met him at the gate with a lever-action rifle held down along her thigh, not raised but present. She was a small woman with gray beginnings at the temples and hands that had been made for the work she now did alone. He touched the brim of his hat. He said his name. He said he was looking to keep going through the winter in exchange for labor. She looked him over for the space of 3 breaths. She looked at the horse longer than she looked at the man. Then she said, "Your horse is thirsty, and he won't drink my creek." Silas said, "No, ma'am, he won't." She nodded once, as if a question she had not asked out loud had been answered, and she opened the gate. That was the first day. There was a dog on the place, an old blue heeler named Ellis, half-blind in one eye and stiff in the hips, who had belonged to the dead husband. Ellis did not bark at Silas. Ellis went to Merritt and stood beneath the horse's belly for a long moment, and Merritt lowered his head and breathed on the dog, and something passed between them that Silas could not name but recognized. He unsaddled the dun in the small pole barn behind the cabin. He rubbed him down with a twist of dry grass. He set out water in a wooden bucket he had drawn from a well by the house, not from the creek, and the horse drank it clean. Silas stood in the barn and thought about that. The talk in Ashen Bend, when he rode in 2 days later for a sack of cornmeal and a length of tarred rope, was that Silas Rourke had gone to work for the widow because he could get no better place. The store owner, a heavy man named Ford Pelter, weighed out the meal and said without looking up, "Heard you're taking your orders from a lady these days." Silas paid him in coin and did not answer. A rancher named Halverson stood by the stove drinking coffee from a tin cup and said, louder than he needed to, "Heard your horse won't drink out of a creek. Heard you let a horse tell you where to ride." He laughed. It was not a mean laugh. It was worse than mean. It was the laugh of a man who genuinely found the idea funny and expected the room to agree with him. The room did agree. Silas took his goods and left. Halverson was the mocker who thought it was funny. There was another kind, and Silas met him on the road home. The reverend of the small Methodist chapel at Ashen Bend was a lean, grave man named Ephraim Ballard, and he pulled his buggy up alongside Silas on the wagon track and said, in a voice that was not unkind but was not warm either, "A man who trusts an animal over his own reason has begun the slow walk toward becoming an animal himself. I speak as one who has watched it happen to better men than you." Silas looked at him. He said, "Yes, sir." He rode on. Ballard was the mocker who found it threatening. Silas had known both kinds all his life. He had learned that the threatening kind was harder to shake because the funny kind eventually got bored, and the threatening kind never did. He came back to the Sanderson place in the early dusk. The dun stopped 100 yards short of the barn and turned his head toward the north pasture. Silas looked. He saw nothing at first. Then he saw what the horse saw, a low fold in the land where the grass grew heavier and greener than it had any right to grow in October, and where a thin trace of steam lifted from the ground in the cold air. He had ridden past that fold 4 times in 3 days and had not noticed it. He noticed it now. He rode down into it. The ground was warmer there by 2 or 3 degrees. It was not much. It was enough. Somewhere below the surface, water was moving, and where water moved underground in a country this cold, he came with it. He marked the place with a stripped willow stake and rode on. Rachel Sanderson was on the porch when he came in. She had watched him ride down into the fold. She said nothing. She had made a stew of turnip and antelope, and they ate it at the plank table inside the cabin while the wind rose outside and Ellis lay against the door with his one good eye half open. Silas said after a long silence, "Ma'am, if it suits, I'd like to move the herd off the south flat and on to the north fold before the week is out." She set her spoon down. She said, "The south flat has better grass." He said, "Yes, ma'am, it does. But the north fold won't freeze the same way." She looked at him. She looked at the door where the old dog lay. She said, "You've been here 4 days." He said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "All right." That was the 2nd week. He did not sleep in the cabin. He slept in the pole barn beside the horse, on a bed of clean straw, with a wool blanket that had belonged to the husband. He rose before the light. He did the work of 2 men, and asked for no praise for it. He watched the dun. He watched the old dog. He watched the small brown birds that gathered at the fence line in numbers that should not have been there so late in the year, and he watched the way the mule deer had begun to come down out of the timber a full month early, moving in small groups toward the shelter of the low creeks. He read all of it. He said nothing about most of it. But he moved the cattle to the north fold over 3 days of slow work, and he cut a fire break between the fold and the timber, and he laid in a store of cut cottonwood along the barn wall on the south side, where the sun would strike it in the mornings, and where the wall would hold what heat the sun gave. Rachel watched him. She was not a foolish woman. She had run a ranch alone for 3 seasons, and she had learned to tell the difference between a man who was working and a man who was performing work. Silas Rourke was working. He was also, she came to see, watching the horse, watching the dog, watching the deer, watching the land, with a particular quality of attention that she had seen in only one other man in her life. Her husband had watched things that way. He had died watching a cow that was about to fall through river ice, and he had known she was going to fall before she fell, and he had gone in after her anyway because he had also known that the cow was carrying twin calves, and it was February, and they could not afford to lose her. That was the kind of watching Rachel had learned to trust. She did not know Silas yet, but she was beginning to. On the 12th day of October the wind changed. It had been coming out of the west, dry and clean, the wind of a good autumn. Now it came out of the northeast, and it carried the smell of iron. Merritt stood at the barn door for a full quarter hour, and would not move. Ellis went twice around the cabin, and then lay down beneath the porch, tucked in tight against the foundation stone, in a place he had not chosen before. Silas said to Rachel at breakfast, "Ma'am, it's coming." She said, "When?" He said, "Inside of a week. Maybe 5 days." She said, "How do you know?" He said, "The horse won't drink from a creek. The dog is under the porch. The deer are already down." She said, "That's not knowing." He said, "No, ma'am, it's not. But it's what I've got, and it's more than the almanac has." She rode into Ashen Bend the next morning. She left him with the herd and the 2 dogs and the horse. She came back after dark. She had spoken with Halverson, and with a rancher named Deal who ran 300 head on the flats east of hers, and with the Reverend Ballard, and with 2 other men whose names Silas did not need to learn. She told him what they had said. Halverson had said that a woman who took her wether from a hired hand and a nervous horse deserved what came of it. Deal had said, more gently, that the year had been ordinary, and there was no cause to think the winter would not be ordinary too. Ballard had said that fear was a form of pride, and that Silas Rourke was teaching her to fear, and that she should send him on before he did more damage than he had already done. Rachel repeated all of this at the table in a voice without heat. Then she said, "I told them to keep their opinions. I told them we're moving the herd tomorrow." Silas said, "Yes, ma'am." He did not thank her. There was no need. They moved the last of the cattle on to the north fold on the 14th. The animals settled into the warmer ground without protest. The old dog took up station on a knob above them and watched. The dun grazed in a small circle at the edge of the herd, choosing his ground with the same care. He chose water, and where he grazed, the cattle followed. Silas laid in more firewood. He banked the north wall of the barn with earth and sod, cut and stacked in overlapping courses. He did not know then that he was practicing a kind of insulation that a Norwegian settler 2 counties over would have recognized instantly. He only knew that his grandfather, a Scots-Irish farrier, who had died before Silas turned 10, had once said that dirt held warmth better than any board a man could nail. He worked from that memory. He worked from the horse. He worked from the dog. He did not work from the almanac. The storm arrived on the night of the 18th. It did not announce itself. There was no dramatic sky, no great clouds rolling in with black skirts. There was only a stillness at 4 in the afternoon that was deeper than any stillness Silas had known in 11 years in that country, and then, at dusk, the first hard flakes came down out of a sky that had gone the color of an old coin. By midnight the wind was up, and by dawn on the 19th there was no dawn, only a gray thickening, and the sound of snow moving sideways past the cabin walls and the low, steady lean of the storm. Silas went to the barn in the dark. He held a rope from the cabin door to the barn door, one he had strung 4 days earlier, without saying what it was for. He found Merritt standing calm in his stall. He found Ellis inside the barn. The old dog had come in on his own, some time in the night, through a gap in the plank that Silas had not known was wide enough for him. The dog was pressed against the horse's foreleg. The horse was breathing on the top of the dog's head. Silas stood in the doorway and watched them for a moment before he stepped in. Then he saw the animals and went back to the cabin along the rope, and he did not let go of the rope even once, because the wind by then was hard enough to lift a man off his feet if the man were foolish enough to stand up straight in it. Rachel had built the fire high. She had put water on for coffee. She was dressed for outside work with her hair tied back, and her husband's heavy coat over her own. She said, "The herd." He said, "The fold will hold them. The wind is coming down the ridge, and the fold is on the lee side. They'll bunch. They'll be cold, but they'll be alive." She said, "You're sure?" He said, "No, ma'am. I'm never sure. But the horse is sure and the dog is sure, and I've stopped arguing with them." The storm ran for 3 full days. On the second morning the sound outside was so loud that when it stopped for a moment, a strange sudden lull in the wind, the kind of gap that comes when a storm shifts on its axis, the silence hit like a struck bell. In that gap Silas heard something he had not expected to hear. It was the sound of a horse coming up the wagon track, moving slow, moving wrong. He went to the door. He opened it a hand's breadth. Through the driven snow he saw a shape, a bay horse, riderless, staggering, the reins broken and trailing. He caught the bay by the halter as it came near the porch. There was blood on the saddle horn. There was no rider. He led the bay into the barn and set him beside Merritt and stripped the saddle. The bay was Halverson's. Silas knew the brand. He shut the barn door. He went back to the cabin. He told Rachel. She said only, "You can't go out." He said, "No, ma'am, not yet." He watched the storm through the small window. The old dog stood at the door with his one good ear lifted. Silas did not know yet what the dog was hearing. He waited. The lull did not last. The storm closed again for another 12 hours, and in that 12 hours Silas Rourke sat at the plank table and cleaned the bay horse's saddle by lamplight and did not speak, and Rachel Sanderson sat opposite him and mended a torn glove, and did not speak either, and Ellis lay on the boards between them with his chin on his paws, and Merritt could be heard from time to time in the barn shifting his weight from foot to foot, and outside the wind ran on and on across the ridge with the steady sound of a great animal grazing. Silas thought about Halverson. He thought about the man's laugh in the store, and the man's easy dismissal, and the man's bay horse now, standing in a widow's barn, while the man himself was somewhere out in the country under snow. He did not feel vindicated. He did not feel anything close to it. He felt only a slow tightening in the chest, the tightening of a man who understands that mockery, at bottom, is a form of under-preparation, and that the price of under-preparation, in this country, in this season, was not paid in embarrassment. On the 3rd morning the storm broke. It was not clear. It only broke. The wind fell off to steady low push, the snow slowed to a fine drift, the sky lightened from iron to pewter. Silas put on the husband's heavy coat that Rachel had laid out for him without a word, and he took his own rifle and a coil of rope and a small bottle of whiskey wrapped in a wool sock, and he saddled Merritt. Ellis stood at the barn door and watched. The old dog did not follow. Silas noted this. He said to the dog, "You stay." The dog was already staying. The dog had been staying for 2 days. The dog had known where the trouble was, and had also known that he was too old for it, and the dog had made his peace with that arrangement in a way that Silas found he envied. He rode Merritt down the wagon track toward Halverson Place. He let the horse choose the path. Merritt went a way Silas would not have gone, up and off the road, along a shoulder of high ground where the snow had scoured thinner, along a line that any map would have said was longer than the direct route, and any experienced hand would have called a waste of daylight. Silas did not correct him. A quarter-mile on, they came down off the shoulder into a low draw, and in the draw, half buried, was Halverson. He was alive. He had been thrown from the bay when the horse spooked at the sound of the storm shifting, and had crawled into the lee of a rock outcrop and dug himself in as best he could, and he had lain there for close to 30 hours with a broken ankle and a shallow gash along his scalp, and he had been, by his own reckoning later, about 2 hours from dying, when the dun horse came down the draw, with Silas Rourke on his back. Silas got him onto Merritt. He walked. Merritt carried the man home. They came into the Sanderson yard at mid-afternoon. Rachel had seen them from a window a half-mile out, and had already stoked the stove, and set the water on, and dragged the cot from the corner into the warm space beside the hearth. Silas brought Halverson inside. Rachel worked on him without speaking. Silas went back out and saw Merritt, and stood a long moment in the barn with his forehead against the horse's neck. He said aloud softly, "All right." It was almost the only word he had said aloud to the horse in the whole 3 days. It was enough. The horse breathed on him, and shifted his weight, and did not require any further conversation. There were others. There were always others in a storm like that. Over the next 2 days 3 more riders came in. A boy of 16 from the Deal outfit who had been sent for a doctor and had gotten only as far as the crossing before his mount foundered. A hired hand from a homestead 5 miles south with 2 frozen fingers and a face gone the color of ash. And on the second afternoon, the Reverend Ballard himself, half broken from cold and shame, having ridden out in the last light of the 3rd day to check on a family east of Ashen Bend, and having become lost on the returning country he had crossed 100 times. Each of them came to the Sanderson gate the same way. Each of them came because the tracks led there. Each of them came because the country, in a hard winter, sorted itself toward warmth, and the warmth was where a dun horse had told a man to build it. Rachel took each of them in. She did not turn any of them away. She did not remind Ballard of what he had told her about fear and pride. She only handed him a bowl of hot broth and a wool blanket, and pointed him toward the cot near the fire where Halverson already lay. Ballard held the bowl in both hands for a long time before he could bring it to his mouth. Then he ate. He did not speak until he was done. When he did speak, it was to Silas, and what he said was, "I was wrong about the horse." Silas nodded. He said, "Yes, sir." He said nothing else. There was nothing else to say, and Ballard was old enough and honest enough to know it. They stayed a week. The storm came back on the 5th day, weaker but longer, and it laid down another foot of snow before it moved off. In that week the small cabin held 7 people and 1 blue heeler, and in the barn behind, 3 horses, and a herd of 240 shorthorn cattle bedded down in the warm ground of the North Fold. None of them died. Not one. The cattle lost weight. The shorthorns always did in a hard blow, but they came through. Halverson, when the swelling in his ankle went down, sat up on the cot and looked around the small cabin, and did not say "I told you so" in reverse. He said only to Rachel, "Ma'am, I'd like to come back in the spring and help you mend the barn. There's a place on the north wall where the boards are pulling." Rachel said, "Thank you, Mr. Halverson. That would be welcome." She did not look at Silas when she said it. She did not need to. They left one by one. Halverson last on a borrowed sledge in the first thaw of November. He tipped his hat to Silas at the gate. He said, "Rourke, I owe you a horse in my life," in that order. Silas said, "You owe me nothing. The horse pulled you out. I only rode him." Halverson looked at him for a long moment. He said, "That's not the whole story, and you know it." Silas said, "Close enough." Halverson rode away. The winter that followed was the worst on the Powder in 20 years. The papers, when they finally came through in the spring, spoke of it. They gave it a name. They counted the losses. In 3 counties 11,000 head of cattle had died. For homesteads had burned to the frame when their occupants had built their fires too hot in a bad chimney and had gone to sleep. 19 men and 2 women had died between the Bighorns and the Belle Fourche. The Sanderson place had lost none. Not one. The story of the dun horse that would not drink from the creek made its way, in pieces, into the small talk of the country, and the story grew, as all such stories grow, and Silas Rourke did not correct any version of it that he heard. He let the story do what a story does. He kept working. He worked for Rachel Sanderson through that winter and into the spring, and in the spring he built her a proper spring house over the small warm seep in the north fold, the same fold Merritt had shown him in October, and the spring house would not freeze in any winter that came after. He built a low earth wall along the north side of the barn that would still be standing 40 years later, and travelers in later decades, seeing it, would ask what it was, and no one would remember exactly, only that a hired hand had built it in the terrible winter of '86, and that it had held. In the middle of March, when the first meadowlarks came back to the fence line, Silas Rourke stood at the door of the barn and watched Merritt walk down to the creek, and this time the horse drank. He drank long and easy, in the way of a horse who has come through a hard thing and knows he has come through it. Ellis stood beside him. The old dog was thinner than he had been in the fall, but he was alive. Silas watched them both for a long time. He understood in that watching that the emergency was over, not because the snow had melted, but because the horse had told him so in the plainest language the animal knew, which was the language of walking to a creek and lowering his head and drinking. Rachel came out of the cabin and stood beside him at the barn door. She did not speak for a while. Then she said, "You'll be moving on." He said, "Yes, ma'am. There's work up in Miles City." She said, "There's work here." He said, "Yes, ma'am. There is. And there will still be in the fall." She looked at him. She said, "In the fall, then." He said, "In the fall." That was the whole of their conversation. It was enough for what needed to be said, and it left room for what did not yet need to be. He rode out in the last week of March. He rode Merritt. Ellis stood on the porch and watched him go. Rachel stood at the gate. Silas turned in the saddle once, at the top of the ridge above the north fold, and he saw the whole of the place spread below him, the barn with its banked north wall, the cabin with its low chimney of pale smoke, the herd on the warm ground of the fold, the small figure of the widow at the gate, and the old dog on the porch. He raised his hand. She raised hers. He rode on. He would come back in the fall. He came back every fall after that for 11 years, until Merritt died of old age in a barn built by a man who by then owned half of the north fold outright, and the widow was no longer a widow, and the story of the horse who would not drink from the creek had passed into the kind of country memory that outlives the men who lived it. But that is a longer telling, and it is not this one. This one ends in March on a ridge above Cold Fork, with a horse drinking easy from a creek he had refused 6 months before. On the frontier, wisdom sometimes walked on 4 legs and asked nothing in return except to be believed. If this story stayed with you, another is already waiting on the far side of the pass.